Unfortunately, one thing that all of us seem to have in common is that we've all been hurt. I'm thinking of the sister and brother who roll their eyes and make fun of the other sister who is simply just trying to help. Or maybe the college student who promises for months to help their mom during college break, but at the last moment flake simply because they'd rather be somewhere else. Or maybe the spouse who disregards the feelings of their spouse when they're being the most vulnerable. Whatever it is, we've all been hurt. And God gives us instructions for what to do when we're hurt. He says, we are to forgive. But that is so incredibly difficult, isn't it? So let's talk about forgiveness. But before we dive in, I want to make sure we're all on the same page. So I want to talk to you about 4 things that forgiveness is not. So forgiveness is not forgetting. You remember that phrase, forgive and forget? I hate that phrase. I hate it. Because that's not quite the truth. Forgiveness is not denying the hurt. Oh, that didn't really bother me. It's fine. It was fine. No, that's not forgiveness. Forgiveness is not excusing their wrong behavior. You know what they did? It really wasn't that bad. They were okay. No, that's not forgiveness either. And lastly, forgiveness is not the same thing as reconciliation. We're going to talk about this a little later, but sometimes reconciliation can happen when we forgive, but other times not. So those are not one and the same. Okay, so now that we're all on the same page on what forgiveness is not, let me give you a definition of forgiveness. There's many out there, but I really like this one. Forgiveness is releasing resentment from the one who has offended or hurt you. It's releasing that resentment. It's releasing that anger without acknowledging without denying the hurt or excusing their behavior. It's releasing, and I like that word releasing because it's giving up to God our anger, our resentment. Now, the Bible makes it very clear, time and time and time again, that we are to forgive. In fact, as I was preparing for this sermon, it wasn't a matter of finding a passage that was relevant. Rather, it was like, which one? There are so many. So let me just show you what I mean. Here's just 3 examples. The first one in Matthew chapter 6 is from the Lord's Prayer, which Jesus tells us to pray. Forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors. And actually that prayer, if you read Matthew chapter 6, it ends with, the very end below the prayer, Jesus says, oh, and remember, if you don't forgive others, God's not going to forgive you. Okay. The next one, Peter comes to Jesus in Matthew chapter 18 and says, how many times should I pray? Is 7 times enough? And Jesus says, not 7 times, but 77 times. Paul even gets in the action of talking about forgiveness all throughout his epistles. And here's an example in Ephesians where Paul says, be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other just as in Christ God forgave you. Okay, so we need to forgive. But it is so incredibly difficult, right? And so to help us this morning, I thought we could look at an example from the Bible of a character who forgave. So we're going to look at David and Saul. So before I begin to read our scripture passage for today, I want to give you some context on where their relationship has gone up until this point of today's passage. And so Saul is king. And David comes and helps Saul in many ways. The first way is that he is a rescuer. He rescues Saul and the Israelites from the Philistines a number of times. The most famous is when he defeats Goliath with God's help. But he ends up defeating hundreds of Philistines over and over and over again, and Saul is so incredibly grateful. But David also plays as an emotional support to Saul because Saul loves his music playing. And Saul invites David to come in all the time to play the lyre and sing for him because Saul, it just relaxes him. It takes him away from the stress of the job as being king. We see their relationship started to switch when the people noticed how amazing David was. As soon as the people said, "Whoa, David, you're awesome," Saul started to feel jealous, fearful, intimidated. Maybe they think David should be king instead of me. And how does Saul respond? He attempts to murder David over and over and over again. And this picture is actually one that comes from the scriptures because David is playing the lyre for Saul because that's what Saul wanted. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, Saul throws a spear at him, attempting to kill him. And from that moment, in an instant, David's entire life is uprooted. It's changed. And from now on, David has to continue to run for his very life. And if David slows down or messes up just once, David will be dead. And that's where we find our passage today. So today I'm going to read for you from 1 Samuel chapter 24. I'm going to read the first 12 verses. Would you stand with me for the reading of God's word? This is 1 Samuel chapter 24, verses 1 through 12. After Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told, "David is in the desert of En-Gedi." So Saul took 3,000 able young men from all Israel and set out to look for David and his men near the crags of the wild goats. He came to the sheep pens along the way. A cave was there, and Saul went in to relieve himself. David and his men were far back in the cave. The men said, "This is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, 'I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish.'" Then David crept up unnoticed and cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Afterward, David was conscience-stricken for having cut off a corner of his robe. He said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lay my hand on him, for he is the anointed of the Lord." With these words, David sharply rebuked his men and did not allow them to attack Saul. And Saul left the cave and went his way. Then David went out of the cave and called out to Saul, "My lord, the king." When Saul looked behind him, David bowed down and prostrated himself with his face to the ground. He said to Saul, "Why do you listen when men say David is bent on harming you? This day you have seen with your own eyes how the Lord delivered you into my hands in the cave. Some urged me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, 'I will not lay my hand on my Lord, because he is the Lord's anointed.' See, my father, look at this piece of your robe in my hand. I cut off the corner of your robe, but did not kill you. See that there is nothing in my hand to indicate that I am guilty of wrongdoing or rebellion. I have not wronged you, but you are hunting me down to take my life. May the Lord judge between you and me, and may the Lord avenge the wrongs you have done to me, but my hand will not touch you." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. So we see all the way up to the start of this scripture, Saul has been in a position of power. He's had all the power. His men outnumbered David 5-1. And up until this moment, Saul has been in the offensive, attempting to kill David, and David has been in the defensive, just fighting and running for his very life. But you see, what happens is David and his men choose a random cave to hide in. David and his few hundred men, let me add. And Saul chooses this one cave for some privacy to relieve himself. Now, the word that says relieve himself actually is in Hebrew that it says to cover his feet, which at the time was a figure of speech to literally mean to poop. So you got to think about this situation here. Saul is trying to find privacy to poop, and little does he know that he's picked the same cave that his enemy and a few hundred men are watching. Like, talk about complete humiliation and vulnerability. Like, this is my worst nightmare. And so the men see Saul, for the very first time, is now in a position of vulnerability. And see, David has a choice here. And his men, David's men, begin to urge him, can't you see? There's no way this is chance. God is delivering Saul. Go kill him. No one will question it. Because everyone saw David as the rightful king. And what do the rightful king? Well, in this time period, if someone was meant to be in the throne, what they did was kill the king. It would not even have been considered murder. And so they urge him, do it, do it. God had to have done this. Do it. And so we see David begin to creep slowly towards Saul, who's pooping, I might add. He creeps slowly towards Saul. And at this moment, the suspense is building. Is he going to do it? And he reaches out and he cuts off a corner of his robe. So he doesn't. He doesn't do it. So I want to ask you, if you were in this position and you had a chance where that person who has been causing you so much pain and turmoil and stress, who has ruined your life, who has treated you unfairly, is finally in a position of vulnerability, and you finally have a chance for vengeance. Now, in our society, it's most likely not murder. But I'm talking even just a moment to say something mean, a moment to have a sneer. Maybe it's just a simple prank. Maybe it's just lacking compassion. Whatever it is, you're finally in the moment where you can have vengeance. What would you do? I'd like to think that I would make the same choice as David. I'd like to think that I wouldn't act out in vengeance. But here is where I think this passage, as amazing as it is, I think that this passage falls short in a message about forgiveness. And this is where I think the passage falls short for this message, is that we see that David doesn't act out in vengeance, but we have no evidence of his heart. And what I mean about this is, for me, I actually am pretty confident. I'm pretty confident that if I were in David's shoes, I would not have murdered Saul. I mean, I could say almost as confidently as I can, I wouldn't have done it. But for me, I think it's more because I wouldn't have had the nerve. Because when someone wrongs me, I usually don't say anything mean. I usually don't do anything mean back. And actually, the person usually has no clue because I can be very nice. But my heart is ugly. My heart is full of bitterness. It's full of resentment. And so just because my actions might be good, my heart is disgusting. And see, Jesus addressed this in the New Testament when he came, because the Old Testament said the proof for following God is in your actions. So if you love God, you do these actions, you do this, you follow these laws. But see, Jesus came and said, yes, those actions and those laws are good, but it's not just about that. If you do those actions, but your heart is not in the right place, there's no use. So here's what Jesus said in Matthew. He said, you may have heard that it was said to the people long ago, you shall not murder, but anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Ooh, so Jesus is saying if I have anger and resentment in my heart, it's as if I murdered them? Ooh, that's very challenging to me. And let me tell you why. Because I grew up with my sister, who's 2.5 years older than me. And let me tell you, we played and we laughed and we had fun for hours and hours and hours and hours. However, we played really well. We were the best of friends, but we could also be the worst of enemies. And see, my sister was the oldest of 5, and along with that, I will tell you, she was very stereotypically the oldest of 5, because she knew what she wanted, she knew how to get it, and she made sure everyone around her, including her 4 younger siblings, made sure they all knew what was best at all times. And couple that with the fact that I was a timid people pleaser, made for a dangerous combination. And for me, it was a lifetime of Anastasia demanding and sometimes manipulating her way on me, and me only being able to say no so many times. Let me give you an example. Anastasia and I loved playing Barbies. Now, let me tell you, We loved playing Barbies. We took Barbie playing to a whole new level. All of our Barbies had names, had a storyline, had a background, had a family, had a home, and we kept with this storyline every time we sat down to play. We took our Barbie playing very seriously. So it's my birthday, and my mom told me for this birthday I could go to a store and pick out any toy I wanted. I'm not good at making decisions, so I took way too long to decide. Finally, I decided on a set of 3 Barbies. And what I loved about this set was that it was a happy birthday set. And there was a cake, and they were celebrating a birthday. I was so excited to bring home these 3 new Barbies to show my sister. We could talk about what their names will be and put them in our storyline and where will they fit, and we'll be so excited. I come home, and I show it to Anastasia, and she says, I love that set. I think I should have it. And I said, no, I mean, it's my birthday. It's mine. She said, no, I think I should have it, and here's why. No, Anastasia, not gonna do it. Finally, she says, after asking many times, she says, okay, it's yours. It's your birthday, that makes sense. But why don't you let me name them, and I will talk them, and they'll be in my families, but they'll still be yours. How about that? And finally, I'm watching myself handing my brand new birthday gift to my sister. When we got older, this didn't change. It was no longer Barbies, it was another thing. I'd come home from school, and she's wearing my jeans. And she says, I was looking through your closet, and I found these, as well as this pile of clothing, and I think that they would be great for me. I think you should give them to me. And I, of course, said, no, those are mine. And she kept asking and asking and asking. And finally, I'm watching myself hand them over. My clothes that I want, that are rightfully mine. And see, after a lifetime of this, I'm in college, and I knew I wanted nothing to do with her. I hated her. I'm done. I don't want a relationship. I don't want anything to do with my sister. And I can be kind to her face. She'll have no clue, but I'm done. And it was my mom who pulled me aside and said, Elizabeth, you've got to forgive her. And I said, forgive her? Forgive her. She doesn't deserve forgiveness. Everything she did was so unfair. All those things she took from me were rightfully mine. Forgive her? No, I won't give her that. I won't. But I slowly began to see the resentment, the bitterness, the ugliness of my heart. But I didn't think it was possible to forgive. So I just began to pray. I just began to pray and ask God, God, help me here. I can't do it. I can't do it alone. You've got to help me forgive. And God slowly began to work at my resentment. And it took about 2 full years. I don't remember an instant in which it was all done, but God slowly worked on my heart. And after 2 years, I remember sitting down once and thinking, hey, I've forgiven her. Let me tell you, it felt so free. And see, what I ultimately needed to do is I ultimately needed to give up to God all of those wrongs, all of that unfairness. I could still acknowledge that what she did was wrong, but I wasn't going to be resentful about it. I had to give that up to God and trust God. And David, when he forgave Saul, he also had to do it, had to do this very same thing. And that's why I ended with verse 12. I want to show you verse 12 again. This is what David said, may the Lord judge between you and me, and may the Lord avenge the wrongs you have done to me. But my hand will not touch you. Do you see here that David, by forgiving Saul, he didn't condone anything Saul did. He didn't excuse the behavior. Actually, quite the opposite. He acknowledged that everything Saul was doing was wrong. But he trusted God. He trusted that God would take care of it. And that's what forgiveness is. Forgiveness is trusting God. And forgiveness is not letting the offenders off the hook, but it is putting them in Saul's hand. Not Saul's hands, putting them in God's hand. Forgiveness doesn't let the offenders off the hook, but rather places them in God's hands. And see, when I forgave my sister finally after 2 years of struggling with it, I realized that forgiveness is not just a command. Forgiveness is also a gift. And it's meant to be a gift for us. And see, one of my favorite parts of my story with Anastasia is that when I finally gave up that resentment and that bitterness, God blessed me in a best friend. And now Anastasia and I, we're best friends. We talk on the phone at least once a week. We are parenting in the same stage together. We laugh together. We cry together. I could not imagine my life without her. And I had it in my own hands to ruin this blessing that God had in mind for me simply because I refused to forgive. But reconciliation does not always happen. See, I love this wording, is that forgiveness opens the door to reconciliation, which is what happened for my sister and I. But it doesn't always happen. In the story of David and Saul, it doesn't happen for them. David forgives Saul, but you know what Saul continues to do? He continues to attempt to kill David. And David spends over a year after that continuing to hide and run for his very life until Saul finally dies in battle apart from David. So sometimes reconciliation doesn't happen. Because here's the deal, guys. It only takes one person to forgive. And we forgive whether or not that person has apologized or whether or not that person has changed. It's our job to forgive. But it takes two people to reconcile. And sometimes that person that we need to forgive doesn't change. And so then rather than reconciliation, what we need is wise, healthy, biblical boundaries. And we can ask God for direction on which. You see, I told you that forgiveness is a gift. We can be gifted with reconciliation. But I also think that when we forgive, we are gifted with a new perspective. And this is my absolute favorite part of my story with Anastasia. Because once I was able to forgive, and once I was able to let go of that resentment, I was able to look back at my past with clear vision that wasn't biased because of my resentment. And when I was able to look back, I could still see the unfairness of Anastasia because she did do some things wrong. But I was also able to see all the ways in which I did not help the situation. See, I could have simply said no and held to it. If I had said, Anastasia, I am not giving you that Barbie no matter what you say. It is mine. It is my birthday gift. She probably would have gotten the idea. But she could see those tendencies of me to be a doormat. She could see that. And see, I allowed myself to be a doormat. And see, here is what I did. I said, yes, Anastasia, you can have my Barbie, lying to myself, telling me that I was being selfless and giving and generous, but in reality, holding on to that resentment as proof of all her unfairness to me. And it was like each time she demanded something more, it's like, good, I have more proof that she's just an awful person. But I was the one handing those things off to her. And see, what's really cool about all of this is that I was able to see, because I forgave, if I hadn't forgiven, I would have been blind to this. I was able to see the damage that my own tendencies were. And can you imagine if I were still that way, how damaging that would be in any relationship I'm in? I mean, especially just my spouse with Thomas. If I'm like giving things away, but yet angry at him for asking, how incredibly damaging that was. So for me, forgiving allowed me to not only acknowledge what she'd done, but also see my own faults and to grow and mature and change. See, forgiveness is a gift that God desperately wants for us. See, when someone comes in there into our lives and hurts us, it's like they've taken a piece of our life and they've broken it and shattered it into a million pieces. And what we're left with is broken glass. And there's no way for us to get that glass back to what it was. But you see, when we choose not to forgive, instead of letting that glass go, we choose to cling and hold on to it in our fists. And look at this picture. Doesn't it just look so painful? Because holding on to broken glass, all it does is hurt us. It's not hurting the offender. We're the ones who just keep cutting into our skin. And when God invites us to forgive, He's inviting us to let go of that glass. He's inviting us to stop hurting ourselves. Forgiveness is a gift. So you might be thinking, okay, Liz, I see this now. I need to let go of that glass. I can't let it continue to hurt me. But how? How do I do it? I've tried and I've tried and I've tried and I just can't. Now, before I talk to you about this list, I want to tell you that forgiveness does not always look the same. Sometimes it's instantaneous, sometimes it takes time, and some things we need to forgive for are those minor issues, whereas other times we have these issues that go deep. So it just can be different. But I do want to give you some advice on how to forgive. I do think the first step is always to admit that you need to. And sometimes it can be those super minor things that didn't even seem like a big deal. But if you find yourself with that resentment, that bitterness, then yes, you even need to forgive those small things. And I found sometimes those small things are the hardest ones to forgive. I encourage you to pray for the offender. My brother gave me some excellent advice when he was only 10 years old that I've clung to the rest of my life. This is what he said. When I'm having a hard time with someone, I just start praying for them every day. Because it's hard to hate someone you pray for. So just start praying faithfully for the offender. But I also invite you to pray to ask God to help you, give you the strength and the power to forgive. And this goes on to the third point, which lean on God to help you forgive. Because forgiveness does not happen through determination. It happens through cooperation with God. So begin to pray and ask God to give you the strength. And that's what I had to do for Anastasia as I was praying faithfully for 2 years to help me forgive. Another suggestion I have here is for this third point is maybe one day just write down every single little tiny thing that person has done that has hurt you, down to the minute detail. And slowly, one by one, forgive for each little thing. And as you do that, cross it off. Give it up to God. Cross it off. Some hurts that we have are deep hurts that we can't do alone. And for those, I encourage you, see a counselor. Have the counselor help you hash out that hurt. And then I have here, forgive as often as needed. Sometimes new things are going to trigger our past hurt. And whereas we might have forgiven them, but now something new is causing it to come up again. So forgive as often as needed, maybe even for the same act. And then remember, forgiveness can take time. Sometimes it's something you can let go with one visit to the altar or whatever it is. But other times it takes years to work on. But I encourage you to be on that journey of forgiveness. So at the beginning of this sermon, I gave you some example hurts. I talked about a brother and sister who ridiculed a sister. I talked to you about a college student who bailed on her mom, and I talked to you about a spouse who disregarded their spouse's feelings. What I did not tell you, that in all three of those instances, that was me. I was the one, just last month, who rolled my eyes, made fun of, and laughed at my sister, Anastasia, when she was simply just trying to help. I promised my mom for months and months and months that I would help her during my break. And then when it came down to it, I bailed on her, simply because I didn't want to. And I disregarded Thomas's feelings when he was just simply sharing with me ideas and hopes for our marriage when he was being the most vulnerable. Guys, do you know what I received each time? Forgiveness. I treated them so unfairly. I didn't deserve it, but they forgave me, and I'm so grateful. And even more so, guys, Jesus has forgiven me. In fact, he died for me. And I took that sacrifice and I disobeyed him and I went my own way. But Jesus forgave me, and he loves me and all of us so much. See, guys, we all struggle to forgive, but we have all been forgiven. And Jesus is simply inviting us to do for others what he's already done for us. See, we are most like Jesus when we forgive others. So this morning, if you have yet to receive his forgiveness, if you are still walking around with the burden of your shame and guilt on your shoulders, Jesus wants you to come and to give him that shame. And he just wants to love you and forgive you. But if you are still walking around, clinging tightly to the broken glass of a past hurt, Jesus doesn't want you to continue hurting yourself. He wants you to let that resentment go, to leave those shattered pieces of glass at his feet and forgive. So this morning, the band is going to sing another song. And during this song, I'm going to open the altars. What perfect place and what perfect time is now to come to the altars, to bring your shame to Jesus and to receive his forgiveness that he so much wants to bestow upon you. Or what better time than here and now to bring those shattered pieces of glass from a broken past and to leave those pieces at the feet of Jesus and to begin your journey of forgiveness. So what will it be? Will you continue to walk around with the hurt that continues to hurt you? Or will you find freedom in forgiveness? It's up to you.